When we think about disaster management, we are often struck by the fact that many natural hazards, for example hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes or even volcanic eruptions, as well as man-made intentional threats such as terrorism or financial or industrial crises, have international consequences. These natural and man-made hazards are often international in the ways that they affect multiple countries and even entire regions of the globe. In many cases, these hazards require international initiatives, responses and solutions when handling them. And as a result, we often talk about the international dimensions of disaster management and even refer to a field of study and practice called international disaster management. In recent decades, international institutions like the United Nations have established dedicated organisations and offices. They hope to promote disaster risk reduction and enhance international coordination of short-term disaster relief and long-term international development assistance. We've also witnessed the growth of international frameworks that have sought to establish international norms, rules and best practice in disaster management. Now, the most obvious case of this is the United Nations Sendai Agreement for Disaster Risk Reduction, adopted in 2015. The Sendai Agreement provides a framework for the coming years, covering 2015 to 2030. And Sendai aims to improve global resilience for disasters. And therefore, for certain, the world has become a great deal better at recognising the international consequences of disasters and the need for active international disaster management. And as part of international disaster management then, there are many instances where foreign policies of respective countries will be affected and will require the foreign policy makers of countries to engage with issues of international disaster management, as well as disaster management communities and officials. Now let's consider a few examples. First, when discussing disaster risk reduction, which is of course increasingly shaped by the international frameworks I've just mentioned, countries are required to develop policy and negotiating positions on international rules, norms and concepts of resilience. Foreign policy makers need to consult with disaster management experts inside their government and with their wider communities for expert advice and simply to consider what is best for their respective country. Indeed, they may have to consider whether their national style of disaster management should be promoted, adapted or protected during these international discussions. And to a certain degree, therefore, such policy makers are not just interacting with international disaster managers, but they've also become international disaster managers in themselves. So we can see a major interaction between foreign policy and disaster management when it comes to risk reduction, mitigation and preparedness. Now, this also applies when considering international early warning systems for tracking the development of potential hazards such as hurricanes, cyclones and typhoons. Here, the international communities need to share information and data to enhance their preparedness for a future shock or landfall. All of this requires the maintenance of cordial foreign relations to build trust and accuracy in working together. Secondly, when a disaster strikes, there has often been many international consequences to deal with as part of the response phase of disaster management. Now, some of these are straightforward international aspects of disaster response. For example, involving the embassies, consulates and foreign offices of the respective governments, dealing with practical issues such as acquiring information on the welfare and situation of respective nationals from overseas, or organising new visas, passports and documentation for those that have lost them, and of course in dealing with international tourists and organising their return home. Thus, there is an important role for foreign policy makers and foreign offices and consulates in handling the very practical issues of disaster response as a crisis unfolds. And it's often the case, however, that disasters do overwhelm the capacities and systems of nations. And this is particularly true given the fact that there are many small states situated in disaster-prone areas of the world. We witnessed this recently, for example, with the case of Hurricanes Irma and Maria, which devastated many Caribbean island nations in 2017. Now, we should not forget also that there are major variations in the levels of development across the nations. Many areas prone to regular disasters, such as typhoons in the Pacific, hurricanes in the Caribbean, volcanic eruptions in Africa, and flooding in the Indian subcontinent, also experience high levels of poverty. Many nations in these areas are regarded as developing countries, and in these cases, the likelihood of a national government to call for international assistance is particularly high. And this requires foreign policy makers of those countries to engage with disaster management issues and to make sure the right kind of message gets out to the international communities. It also requires foreign policy makers and international institutions to be part of an international dialogue on how to process international disaster relief, decide how much relief can be organised and how quickly it can get there. And of course, then there's disaster recovery. Once again, foreign policy aspects come into the play there. Many countries have their own national development and aid programmes, and most contribute to longer-term international assistance. Now, one simple point that frequently needs to be made is that if disasters are defined as key events that overwhelm the national capacity and systems of a country, then international assistance in implementing recovery from such disasters will be highly desirable and in many instances absolutely essential. Where damage from a disaster is extensive, say in the case of the 2010 Haiti earthquake, which left 1.5 million homeless or displaced, and where there have been continuing problems with health, such as cholera epidemics, international assistance may need to be offered and be there for a very long time. And the link back, therefore, to help building best practice in risk reduction often requires international guidance, training and assistance that takes us full circle back to the mitigation aspects of international disaster management. Now, given this line of reasoning, it can be argued that the dialogue and interactions between foreign policy makers and disaster managers should be consistent, regular and systemic. Now, foreign policy, therefore, can be about disaster management, and equally, disaster management has many foreign policy implications. Just as disaster managers often talk about bouncing forwards from disasters, foreign policy makers make this as an important learning opportunity to undertake more effective foreign policy and enact international influence. So if that is the case, then, what do we mean by foreign policy? How is it defined? And what does it actually include? Now, this is not as easy as it first appears, particularly in an increasingly independent world where the boundaries of foreign policy and domestic policies are becoming blurred and often fused. Scholars of foreign policy, for example, have defined foreign policy in differing ways and emphasise various aspects. Webber and Smith, for example, have defined foreign policy as, quote, composing of the goals sought, the values set, the decisions made, and the action taken by states and national governments, unquote. The aim, according to them at least, is, quote, to design, manage and control the foreign relations of national societies, unquote. So for Webber and Smith, foreign policy is quite comprehensive in outlining the processes and procedures that it might include. It covers goals, it covers values, it covers decisions made and actions taken. For disaster managers, who are often concerned with writing emergency plans and operating a national disaster management system, it's important to recognise that the international dimensions previously mentioned will also be covered within the remit of foreign policy used here. Webber and Smith also take a very nation-state-centric perspective, in that foreign policy is associated with states, and particularly national governments. They also highlight that foreign policy is tied to the decisions and actions taken on behalf of national societies. There's a strong link here between governmental authority and their ability to perform duties and functions on behalf of their national societies. It's performance orientated. Importantly, foreign policy makers are as much aware as disaster managers are that there are expectations about their role arising from national societies and populations. They will all be under pressure to get it right when it comes to planning for, responding to and recovering from disasters. Now, another esteemed scholar, Professor Christopher Hill, has defined foreign policy as being essentially about, quote, the sum of official external relations, unquote, and that it's usually conducted by an independent actor such as a state. For him, foreign policy is primarily about, quote, political strategies conducted by these independent actors, unquote, and therefore essentially political and strategic in nature. So with his definition of foreign policy, there is more of a recognition that foreign policy can be conducted by independent actors operating at more than simply the national level of and within states. And in particular, regional and even municipal and local governments increasingly have developed their own international relations outside of their respective territory. They're involved in what has been called elsewhere as parallel diplomacy or subnational diplomacy. They have, after all, often their own international offices and officials who conduct local foreign policy with other regions of other countries, and indeed have representations that seeks to lobby and influence international organisations, such as in the case of the European Union. So for disaster managers then, this is increasingly useful in helping to understand that foreign affairs is conducted at many levels, and that cooperation with foreign policy makers may require a dialogue not just with national ministries and their respective ministries of foreign affairs. They may need to be with also and go beyond that to look at regional and even local levels and liaise with officials at those levels. Interestingly, a major international authority on foreign policy, Professor Walter Karlsnäs from Sweden, envisages foreign policy to be about, quote, those actions expressed as explicitly stated goals and commitment and pursued by governmental representatives that deal with issues and aspects that lie beyond the territorial legitimacy of their respective states. Now, this is important from the perspective of disaster management. Not only does it illustrate that foreign policy actively covers disasters that go beyond such territorial legitimacy of single states, but it also highlights that foreign policy includes relations by governmental representatives with non-governmental organisations, with private business and even multinational corporations. These remain important private actors that disaster managers need to work with as stakeholders in their emergency planning, and they're often international in nature. Using foreign policy makers to influence such international private agencies, bodies and business can only help to make and improve disaster management overall. But why have I mentioned these three definitions of foreign policy then? And what does it do when helping to think about the relationship between foreign policy and disaster management? So let's end with three important observations. First, due to the international dynamics of disasters, there are notable synergies between the worlds of international crisis and disaster management and that of foreign policy. These synergies are often evident at all phases of the disaster management cycle. There is much to talk about and interact between. Second, definitions of what foreign policy includes are diverse. Defining and understanding what foreign policy includes is not as easy as it first appears. It's important for disaster managers to recognise that foreign policy is a dynamic area, and this offers opportunities for disaster management to interact with it in a dynamic way. Third observation. Disaster managers and those interested in disaster management need to analyse foreign policy dynamics and indeed the motives of foreign policy makers in greater detail in order to make international disaster management more effective. Foreign policy remains part of the solution to enhancing international resilience that may ultimately save lives, reduce casualties and protect property at times of crisis. With this in mind then, there is a need to delve deeper and a little deeper into foreign policy analysis, FPA as it's called, and what it can ultimately provide in helping to ensure that disaster management remains at central to the aims, priorities and behaviour of both foreign policy makers and disaster managers together.